The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany tables of Le Grand Lumière, where the city's elite gathered on this bustling Friday evening. The soft murmur of sophisticated conversation mixed with the gentle clink of wine glasses, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. At table 7, Richard Beaumont adjusted his Armani tie and surveyed the dining room with the satisfied air of a man who belonged in such places. "Darling, this place never disappoints," his wife Margaret purred, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she reached for her champagne flute. "The ambiance is absolutely divine." Keisha Williams approached their table with practiced grace, her black uniform crisp and professional despite the weight of exhaustion behind her eyes. She had been on her feet for 6 hours straight, but her smile remained genuine as she placed the leather-bound menus before the couple. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Welcome to Le Grand Lumière. May I start you with something to drink?" Richard barely glanced up from his phone, his fingers drumming impatiently on the white tablecloth. When Chef Laurent appeared tableside to discuss the evening's specials, Richard's demeanor shifted entirely. "Ah, Laurent," he exclaimed in heavily accented French. "Comment allez-vous ce soir? We're looking forward to another magnificent meal." Margaret giggled behind her manicured hand. "Honey, don't bother speaking French anymore. She can't even read the menu properly." Her voice carried just loud enough for nearby tables to overhear, and Keisha felt the familiar sting of public humiliation wash over her. Richard's eyes found Keisha for the first time, his gaze cold and dismissive. These people should stick to fast food places where they belong, not fine dining. The words hung in the air like poison, and Keisha's hands tightened imperceptibly around her order pad. She took a steady breath, drawing on reserves of dignity that ran deeper than the ocean. "Is there anything specific I can help you with this evening?" she asked, her voice remaining level despite the fire building in her chest. "Well, for starters, you can learn some basic education before working here." Richard sneered, deliberately knocking over his wine glass. The burgundy liquid spread across the pristine tablecloth like spilled blood. "Clean it up, and next time, try to be more careful around your betters." The surrounding tables fell silent, all eyes turning toward the unfolding drama. Keisha felt the weight of their stares, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the spectacle. She knelt gracefully to begin cleaning the deliberately created mess, her movements betraying none of the rage coursing through her veins. "Monsieur," she said quietly, rising to meet Richard's gaze, "votre comportement est absolument inacceptable." The words flowed from her lips with perfect Parisian pronunciation, each syllable crisp and unmistakable. Richard's face flushed red, his mouth falling open slightly. Margaret's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. The transformation was instantaneous. Shock, then fury, as if Keisha had committed some unforgivable transgression by proving their assumptions wrong. "How dare you speak to me like that?" Richard sputtered, his voice rising to a pitch that drew even more attention. "Manager! Manager! I want this insolent girl fired immediately!" As Keisha bent to gather the last of the glass shards, a small leather-bound book slipped from her apron pocket. The gold-embossed logo of the Sorbonne glinted in the chandelier light for just a moment before she quickly retrieved it. At a corner table, Vincent Sterling's weathered hands trembled slightly around his wineglass, his sharp grey eyes fixed on Keisha's face with sudden recognition. "Those eyes," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. "Professor Williams' daughter. But that can't be. She should be." Vincent fell silent, his mind racing as memories flooded back of a brilliant colleague and the promising young woman he'd once known. Meanwhile, Richard Beaumont felt an uncomfortable stirring of familiarity as he watched Keisha's graceful composure under fire. Something about her bearing, a quiet dignity in the face of his attack, reminded him of someone he'd rather forget. But he pushed the feeling aside with characteristic arrogance. "Ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "Just my imagination." Keisha Williams stood in the small bathroom at the back of Le Grand Lumière, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her dark eyes held depths that spoke of struggles far beyond her 28 years, yet they burned with an intelligence that no amount of hardship could diminish. She splashed cool water on her face and straightened her shoulders, preparing to face whatever consequences awaited her. Her life had not always been this hard. Growing up as the daughter of Professor Marcus Williams, she had been surrounded by books, philosophical discussions, and the unwavering belief that education could change the world. Her father had been a beloved figure at the local university, known for his passionate lectures on ethics and social justice. His students, ranging from working-class drivers to children of privilege, all left his classroom with a deeper understanding of human dignity. "Baby," her mother Dorothy would often say during those golden years, "your daddy sees the potential in everyone. That's his gift." Dorothy Williams had been an elementary school teacher, her gentle wisdom complementing her husband's academic fervor. Together, they had created a home where intellectual curiosity flourished and every person's worth was recognized. But cancer had stolen Marcus Williams when Keisha was 24, just as she was completing her doctoral studies at the Sorbonne. The medical bills had drained their savings, and when Dorothy's own diagnosis came 2 years later, Keisha made the heartbreaking decision to put her academic career on hold. Now she lived with her mother in a cramped one-bedroom apartment across town, working double shifts to afford Dorothy's treatments. The commute to Le Grand Lumière took an hour each way on public transportation, but the upscale restaurant paid better than most, and every dollar mattered when choosing between medication and groceries. Each night after work, Keisha would come home to find her mother propped up in bed, waiting with eager eyes despite her exhaustion. They had maintained their ritual of reading together, working their way through Baudelaire, Voltaire, and Sartre. Sometimes Dorothy would drift off mid-sentence, but Keisha would continue reading softly, her voice a comfort in the darkness. "Education is the one thing they can never take away from you," Dorothy would whisper on her good days, echoing the words her husband had spoken countless times. "Your daddy always said that. Knowledge lives in here." She would tap her chest. "And here," pointing to her temple. "No matter what job you have to do." Keisha's most treasured possession was her father's vintage pocket watch, an elegant piece from the 1940s that had belonged to his own father. Inside the cover, Marcus had engraved the words, "La vérité libère," "The truth liberates." She wore it every day beneath her uniform, pressing her fingers against it whenever she needed strength. Hidden in their small closet, wrapped carefully in silk, lay Keisha's PhD diploma from the Sorbonne. Her dissertation on social justice and economic inequality in post-colonial France had been praised by her committee as groundbreaking work. She had been offered a position as associate professor, with colleagues eager to collaborate on her research. But that life felt like another world now, as distant as the stars. Her laptop contained dozens of unread emails from academic contacts, conference invitations, and publication opportunities. Each notification was a reminder of the path she had abandoned, the career that waited in the shadows, while she fought to keep her mother alive. The irony was not lost on her that she, a doctor of philosophy specializing in economic inequality, now lived that inequality every day. But Keisha had made her choice with clear eyes and a full heart. Her father had taught her that knowledge without compassion was worthless, and that true wisdom meant understanding when to set aside personal ambitions for something greater. On the apartment's small bookshelf sat a faded photograph. Keisha in her graduation robes standing before the historic gates of the Sorbonne, her smile radiant with accomplishment. Next to it, a newer photo showed her father receiving a teaching award, surrounded by diverse students whose lives he had touched. In that second image, a young Richard Beaumont stood in the back row, his expression sullen and resentful. But Keisha had no idea of that connection as she prepared to return to the dining room, her father's watch ticking steadily against her heart, reminding her that truth and dignity were worth any sacrifice. Marcus, the restaurant manager, met Keisha at the staff station with apologetic eyes. A kind man in his 40s who had worked his way up from busboy to management, Marcus understood the crushing weight of prejudice. His own journey from Honduras had been marked by similar encounters with people who judged his worth by his accent rather than his character. "Keisha, I'm sorry," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I don't want to do this, but Beaumont is threatening to pull his business from all 3 of his restaurant properties. He's demanding I fire you, or he'll make sure I lose my job too." The words hit Keisha like a physical blow, but she kept her expression steady. She had expected this outcome the moment Richard Beaumont's voice had risen in indignation. Men like him didn't simply move on from having their worldview challenged. They used their power to ensure such challenges never happened again. "I understand," she said simply, untying her apron with hands that didn't shake. "When do you need me to leave?" "Take a week's suspension while I investigate," Marcus said, his voice heavy with the knowledge that they both understood this charade. Maybe by then he'll have moved on to tormenting someone else. But Richard Beaumont was just getting started. From his penthouse office overlooking the city, he began making phone calls with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to getting his way. His secretary maintained a detailed contact list of restaurant owners, hotel managers, and hospitality executives throughout the metropolitan area. "There's a problematic black waitress named Keisha Williams," he told the manager of the Grand View Hotel's signature restaurant. "She's confrontational, rude to customers, and completely unprofessional. I'd strongly advise against hiring her if she applies to your establishment." The conversation was repeated a dozen times throughout the week, each call building an invisible wall around Keisha's employment prospects. Beaumont's influence in the hospitality industry was considerable, his restaurants alone generating millions in revenue annually. Few managers were willing to risk their relationship with such a powerful figure over one unknown server. When Keisha began applying for positions at other upscale establishments, she was met with polite but firm rejections. "Your resume looks impressive," they would say, "but we're not hiring at the moment." The speed of the rejections, often within hours of her application, told her everything she needed to know. Desperate, she accepted a position at Mario's Fast Casual, a small chain restaurant where the pay was half what she'd earned at Le Grand Lumière. The work was harder, the customers less refined, but the manager, José's uncle, was willing to give her a chance despite the mysterious phone calls he'd received warning against her employment. José Morales, 19 and full of dreams about opening his own restaurant someday, quickly became Keisha's ally. He had the kind of optimistic spirit that refused to be crushed by daily microaggressions and casual cruelty. When customers made comments about his accent or questioned whether he was legal, Jose would smile and work twice as hard to prove them wrong. "My mama always says," he told Keisha during a quiet moment, "they can try to break our spirits, but they cannot break our hearts. As long as our hearts stay strong, we keep fighting." It was during her second week at Mario's that fate delivered Richard Beaumont to her counter. He entered with the swagger of a man who owned the world, his expensive suit standing out dramatically among the casual dining crowd. But his presence here wasn't coincidental. He had heard through his network that Keisha was working at this location. "Well, well," he said loudly enough for other customers to hear. "Look who's found her proper level. This is much more appropriate, don't you think?" Keisha felt every eye in the restaurant turn toward her, the familiar weight of public humiliation settling on her shoulders. She had learned to recognize the particular cruelty of people who went out of their way to kick others when they were down. "Can I take your order, sir?" she asked, her voice professional despite the tremor of anger beneath. "Can you even understand what I'm saying?" Richard asked with mock concern. "Do they teach English in your neighborhood, or should I speak more slowly?" Jose stepped forward from behind the grill, his young face flushed with righteous anger. "Sir, please be respectful to my colleague." Richard's attention shifted to Jose like a predator sensing new prey. "Another one? This country is being overrun by people who don't belong here. Look around. This is what America has become." The restaurant fell silent except for the hum of refrigeration units and the distant sound of traffic. Keisha felt something snap inside her chest. Not the brittle crack of breaking, but the strong snap of a spine straightening to its full height. "That's enough," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You don't get to talk to my friend like that. You don't get to talk to anyone like that." Richard's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This was exactly the reaction he had hoped to provoke. He pulled out his phone and began recording, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of someone documenting evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when unqualified people work in customer service. Disrespectful and aggressive behavior toward paying customers." He panned the camera to capture both Keisha and Jose, their faces tight with anger and humiliation. Within hours, the video had been uploaded to multiple social media platforms with captions designed to inflame, entitled "Service Workers Attack Customer" and "This is What's Wrong with America Today." The comment section filled with supporters of Richard's position, praising him for standing up to entitled behavior and demanding consequences for the aggressive employees. But Richard wasn't finished. He called Mario's owner directly, leveraging the same network of influence that had made Keisha unemployable at upscale establishments. "I want both of them fired," he demanded. "The black girl and the Mexican boy. They're clearly unsuited for customer service, and their behavior reflects poorly on your establishment." The owner, a tired man juggling 3 locations and mounting debt, couldn't afford to lose any business. Within an hour, both Keisha and Jose found themselves unemployed, their names now attached to a viral video that painted them as problem employees. Keisha sat in the sterile waiting room of Metropolitan General Hospital, her father's watch heavy in her palm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glow that made the world seem drained of color. Through the small window, she could see her mother sleeping fitfully, connected to machines that beeped with mechanical regularity. Dorothy's condition had worsened rapidly after Keisha lost her job at Mario's. The stress of unpaid bills, the inability to afford her medications, and the worry over her daughter's situation had taken a devastating toll. The doctors spoke in careful professional tones about treatment options and managing symptoms, but their eyes held the truth that words couldn't convey. Keisha opened her laptop, its screen flickering to life in the dim waiting room. Her email inbox showed dozens of unread messages, most of them automatic newsletters and promotional content. But there, highlighted in bold, was a message from an address she recognized, Correspondance à Sorbonne DUFR. For months she had deleted these emails without reading them, unable to bear the reminder of the life she had abandoned. But tonight, with her mother fighting for each breath and her own future seeming impossibly dark, she clicked it open. "Dr. Williams," the email began, "your sabbatical ends next month. The philosophy department is eagerly awaiting your return. Your research on social justice and economic inequality has been cited 847 times since publication, and several international conferences have requested your participation as a keynote speaker. Will you be resuming your position as associate professor?" The words blurred as tears filled Keisha's eyes. Associate professor. Dr. Williams. These titles felt like echoes from another life, reminders of a version of herself that seemed to exist only in memory. She thought of her father's voice, strong and clear, as he delivered lectures that changed students' lives. She thought of his hands, gentle and sure, as he inscribed "La vérité libère" inside his watch. Through the window, Dorothy stirred, her eyes opening to find her daughter's face. Even in her weakened state, she seemed to sense Keisha's inner turmoil. "Baby," she whispered when Keisha entered the room. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world." Keisha took her mother's frail hand, feeling the papery skin and prominent veins. "I'm sorry, Mama. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you from this." Dorothy's eyes, still sharp despite her illness, studied her daughter's face. "Protect me from what? From cancer? Child, that's not your responsibility, but I can see something else is bothering you." Keisha looked down at the watch in her free hand, its familiar weight both comforting and challenging. "I keep thinking about Daddy's classes, how he used to tell his students that knowledge was a responsibility, not just a privilege. Your father believed that education meant nothing if it wasn't used to lift others up," Dorothy said softly. "But he also knew that sometimes you have to step into the light for people to see what's possible." As if summoned by their conversation, Keisha's phone buzzed with a news alert. The video of her confrontation with Richard Beaumont had continued to spread, but now it was being picked up by larger media outlets. Local news producer Sarah Chen had been following the story, recognizing something deeper than a simple customer service dispute. The email from Sarah was brief, but compelling. "Ms. Williams, I'd like to offer you the opportunity to tell your side of the story. Mr. Beaumont has agreed to appear on our live discussion program tomorrow evening. Would you be willing to join us?" Keisha stared at the message, her heart pounding. Every instinct told her to decline, to remain invisible and avoid further humiliation. But her father's voice seemed to whisper from the watch in her hand, reminding her of lessons about courage and truth. She looked at her mother, who was watching her with knowing eyes. "Mama," Keisha said quietly, "I think it's time to stop hiding." Dorothy squeezed her daughter's hand with surprising strength. "Your father always said the truth has a way of demanding to be heard. Maybe it's time you listened." The next morning, Keisha sat at her laptop and began typing responses to the Sorbonne, to colleagues who had reached out over the months, to the parts of herself she had buried beneath exhaustion and necessity. But first she typed a simple reply to Sarah Chen. "Yes, I'll be there." The Channel 7 news studio buzzed with nervous energy as cameras were positioned and lighting adjusted for the evening's special broadcast. Sarah Chen, a respected journalist known for her thoughtful approach to controversial topics, had promoted the show as an exploration of workplace dynamics and social expectations in modern America. In the green room, Richard Beaumont adjusted his silk tie and checked his reflection in the mirror. He wore his most expensive suit, a charcoal grey Armani that spoke of success and authority. His confidence radiated from every pore. This would be his opportunity to set the record straight, to show the public that he was the victim of an ungrateful employee's attempt at manipulation. The American people deserve to know what really happened, he told his assistant, who nodded enthusiastically while taking notes for the inevitable social media campaign. This girl thought she could intimidate me with her attitude, but I won't be bullied by anyone, regardless of their background. Meanwhile, in a small dressing room down the hall, Keisha sat quietly in a simple navy blouse and black slacks. She had brought only one accessory, a small briefcase that had belonged to her father. Inside were the documents that told the story of who she really was, carefully organized and verified by the university's registrar office. Sarah Chen appeared in the doorway, her expression kind but professional. "Ms. Williams, are you ready for this? I want you to know that we'll maintain a respectful environment, but Mr. Beaumont seems quite eager to present his case." Keisha nodded, her fingers finding the familiar outline of her father's watch beneath her blouse. "I'm ready." As they made their way to the studio, neither Keisha nor the production staff noticed Vincent Sterling settling into a seat in the back row of the studio audience. The elderly billionaire had seen the news coverage and immediately recognized the face that had haunted his thoughts since that evening at Le Grand Lumière. His presence was unannounced, his silver hair and expensive but understated clothing allowing him to blend in among the other audience members. But his eyes never left Keisha as she took her place across from Richard Beaumont under the bright studio lights. The red recording light flickered on, and Sarah Chen addressed the camera with practiced professionalism. "Good evening. Tonight we're examining a story that has sparked intense debate across social media platforms and in workplaces nationwide. A confrontation between a customer and a restaurant employee has raised questions about respect, expectations, and how we treat one another in professional settings." She turned to Richard first, her expression neutral. "Mr. Beaumont, you've stated that you were mistreated by Ms. Williams during your visit to Le Grand Lumière restaurant. Can you tell us what happened from your perspective?" Richard leaned forward slightly, his posture confident and commanding. "Sarah, I'm glad you're giving me this opportunity to set the record straight. Look, I'm not a racist person. I employ dozens of black employees across my businesses. But this woman was rude, uneducated, and couldn't even understand basic French conversation. She simply doesn't belong in a fine dining environment." He gestured dismissively toward Keisha, who sat with remarkable composure, her hands folded calmly in her lap. People need to understand their place in society. Not everyone is cut out for sophisticated environments, and there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that fact. Richard warmed to his theme, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an obvious truth. "I received excellent education, learned from great professors. Well, most of them were great. There was this one idealistic professor who thought everyone deserved equal treatment regardless of their background. But the real world doesn't work that way." Several audience members nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Vincent Sterling's hands tightened on his cane as memories of Professor Marcus Williams flooded back. Sarah turned to Keisha, her expression encouraging. "Ms. Williams, how do you respond to these allegations about your education and your behavior that evening?" Keisha rose slowly from her chair, her movement graceful and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear diction and confidence of someone accustomed to addressing lecture halls. May I respond in the language Mr. Beaumont claimed I couldn't understand? Without waiting for permission, she began speaking in flawless French, her Parisian accent precise and educated. Monsieur Beaumont, votre français est, comment dit-on, élémentaire. Your accent suggests perhaps 2 years of high school French, at best. The studio audience gasped audibly, and Richard's face flushed red with embarrassment and rage. But Keisha continued, switching back to English with the fluid ease of someone truly multilingual. You mispronounced coq au vin as coq au vine. The correct pronunciation is. She demonstrated perfectly, the words flowing like music. Sarah Chen leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Mr. Williams, can you tell us about your educational background? Keisha reached into a briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio. For the record, I hold a PhD in philosophy from the Sorbonne University, specializing in social justice and economic theory. She handed the documents to Sarah, who examined them with growing amazement. I also hold master's degrees in French literature and international relations. I'm currently on sabbatical from my position as associate professor at the Sorbonne to care for my mother, who has cancer. The silence in the studio was deafening. Richard Beaumont's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his confident demeanor crumbling in real time. These documents appear to be authentic, Sarah announced after examining them. Dr. Williams, if I may ask, why were you working as a waitress? Keisha's voice remained steady, but emotion flickered in her eyes. My mother has cancer. I took a sabbatical to care for her and needed additional income for her medical bills. I'm not ashamed of honest work. What I'm ashamed of is how people like Mr. Beaumont treat working-class individuals based on their assumptions about race and education. The audience began to murmur, the tide of opinion clearly shifting. Richard felt his control of the narrative slipping away like sand through his fingers. That's impossible, he sputtered, jabbing his finger toward Keisha. You're just a waitress. This has to be some kind of setup. Where did you get these fake credentials? Sarah held up the documents again. Mr. Beaumont, I've had our researchers verify these with the universities. They're completely authentic. Dr. Williams graduated summa cum laude. Richard Beaumont felt the studio walls closing in around him as his carefully constructed narrative collapsed. The confident businessman who had entered the studio an hour earlier was rapidly being replaced by a desperate man watching his reputation disintegrate in real time. Mr. Beaumont, you mentioned I don't belong in sophisticated environments, Keisha said, her voice calm and analytical. Let's explore that statement. She stepped slightly closer, her trained eye reading his body language with the precision of someone who had spent years studying human behavior. I can see you're getting agitated. Your hands are shaking. Your voice is rising. Richard looked down at his hands in horror, realizing she was right. The tremor he thought he had controlled was visible to everyone in the studio. When I spoke French perfectly, I saw fear flash across your face. Keisha continued, her tone that of a professor delivering a lecture. When my credentials were verified, you looked panicked. You're not angry because I was rude. You're angry because I shattered your assumptions about who I am. The question is, why does my intelligence threaten you so much? Richard exploded from his chair, his composure finally cracking completely. Threaten me? Don't flatter yourself. I'm not threatened by anyone. His voice rose to a near shout, spittle flying as he gestured wildly. You think you're so smart, analyzing me like some lab rat? This is ridiculous. I'm shaking because I'm angry, not scared. Angry that you're trying to manipulate this situation. He pointed an accusing finger at her, his face red with fury. Just because you have some fancy degrees doesn't mean you can psychoanalyze me on live television. I've dealt with hundreds of employees. I know manipulation when I see it. The irony was lost on Richard that his explosive reaction was proving Keisha's point more effectively than any argument could. The audience watched in fascination as a powerful man unraveled before their eyes, his privileged facade cracking to reveal something ugly underneath. Keisha remained perfectly still during his outburst, then responded with devastating calm. You said I couldn't understand French. Yet when I responded in perfect French, you immediately switched tactics. You said I was uneducated. When faced with my credentials, you claimed they were fake. You said I was rude and aggressive. But who is shouting right now, Mr. Beaumont? She paused, letting the question hang in the air as the studio audience began to see the pattern clearly. This suggests the problem isn't my qualifications. It's your assumptions about who deserves respect. Keisha pulled out her phone, her movements deliberate and controlled. Let me play a recording of our interaction at the restaurant. You can't record people without consent. That's illegal! Richard protested desperately. Sarah interjected professionally. Actually, Mr. Beaumont, in this state, one-party consent recording is completely legal. The audio played clearly through the studio speakers. Richard's voice, dripping with condescension as he told his wife that these people should stick to fast food, his deliberate humiliation of Keisha, and his demand that she be fired for her insolence. When Margaret Beaumont's voice came through saying, "She can't even read the menu properly," followed by their cruel laughter, several audience members audibly gasped. "Mr. Beaumont," Keisha said as the recording ended, "you keep saying you judge people by behavior. Let's examine that." Her voice took on the rhythmic cadence of a skilled lecturer building toward a crucial point. When I served you professionally, you saw attitude. When I spoke French, you saw showing off. When I defended myself, you saw aggression. But when Mr. Sterling speaks, when the host speaks, when anyone who looks like you speaks, you see confidence, intelligence, leadership. She spread her hands, encompassing the studio and the millions watching at home. The behavior is the same. The only difference is your perception. True sophistication isn't about money or status. It's about how we treat those who have nothing to offer us in return. The studio fell silent, except for the hum of cameras and the distant sound of traffic outside. Even the production crew had stopped moving, transfixed by the intellectual dismantling they were witnessing. "You failed that test spectacularly," Keisha concluded, her words carrying the weight of absolute truth. Sarah Chen received an urgent message in her earpiece and looked up with excitement. "We're just receiving word that viewers are responding overwhelmingly to this discussion. Social media is exploding with people sharing their own experiences of being prejudged. The hashtag #UrgSophistication test is trending worldwide." At that moment, Vincent Sterling rose from his seat in the back of the studio. His movement was slow but purposeful, the authority of 8 decades commanding attention without effort. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone accustomed to being heard. "May I say something?" Sarah looked surprised but intrigued. "So this is a live broadcast, but if you have something relevant to add..." Vincent stepped forward, his expensive but understated clothing marking him as someone of substance. "I knew her father. Professor Marcus Williams was my mentor, and one of the greatest men I've ever known." Richard Beaumont's face drained of color as if he'd seen a ghost. "Williams? No, that can't be." The pieces were falling into place with devastating precision. Vincent's voice grew stronger as he addressed the studio and the television audience beyond. "Mr. Beaumont, you were in Professor Williams' ethics class, too. Spring semester, 1978. You remember what he taught us about character, don't you?" Richard backed against his chair, trapped between his past and his present, both now exposed under the harsh studio lights. "That professor, your father," he stammered, pointing shakily at Keisha. "He gave me a C, said I lacked empathy and moral foundation. He tried to ruin my future." His voice cracked with decades of buried resentment. "I proved him wrong. I became successful despite his so-called teachings." Vincent Sterling shook his head slowly, disappointment etched in every line of his weathered face. "Richard, you haven't changed. You still think success gives you the right to look down on others. Professor Williams didn't try to ruin your future. He tried to save your soul." Keisha stood perfectly still, absorbing the revelation that her tormentor had once sat in her father's classroom, had heard the same lessons about dignity and respect that had shaped her own worldview. The cosmic justice of the moment was not lost on her. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, her voice carrying both authority and sadness, "you said people need to know their place. You're absolutely right." She stepped forward, no longer the defensive waitress, but every inch the professor she truly was. "Your place is not as judge of others' worth based on their skin color or circumstances. Your place is learning that dignity belongs to every human being, regardless of their job, their race, or their economic status." Looking directly at the broken man before her, she delivered the final blow with surgical precision. "My father gave you a C because he saw what I see now. Wealth without wisdom, success without soul." Vincent Sterling added his voice to the judgment, his words carrying the weight of lived experience. Professor Williams always said, "A student's character is revealed not in how they treat their superiors, but how they treat those they perceive as beneath them." Keisha nodded, her father's wisdom flowing through her like a river finding its course. "You failed that test then, Mr. Beaumont. You're failing it now." The studio erupted in spontaneous applause, the audience rising to their feet as the truth of the moment resonated in their hearts. Social media exploded with commentary, the video clips already being shared millions of times as people recognized something profound happening in real time. Richard Beaumont stood alone in the center of the storm, his empire of prejudice crumbling around him. The man who had entered the studio to destroy a waitress was leaving as the architect of his own downfall. Keisha raised her voice above the applause, her final words ringing with the clarity of absolute truth. "And my place? It's wherever justice needs a voice, just like my father taught." 2 weeks after the broadcast that changed everything, Keisha Williams sat beside her mother's hospital bed, watching Dorothy sleep peacefully for the first time in months. The GoFundMe campaign started by viewers had raised enough money to cover all of Dorothy's treatments, and the experimental therapy was already showing promising results. The offers had poured in like rain after a drought: book deals, speaking engagements, documentary proposals, and interview requests from major networks around the world. But Keisha had turned them all down, choosing instead to focus on what truly mattered. Marcus, her former manager at Le Grand Lumière, had called personally to offer her not just her old job back, but a promotion to head of staff training. "I want you to help us create a better environment for everyone," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Marcus," Keisha had replied gently, "but I have a different path now." That path led to the creation of the Dorothy Williams Foundation, named in honor of her mother's lifetime of service to children. The foundation provided scholarships for students of color pursuing higher education, with a special focus on first-generation college students from working families. Jose Morales had been their first recipient, his dreams of culinary school finally within reach. When Keisha handed him the scholarship check, his eyes filled with tears. "Dr. Williams," he had said, "you changed everything for me." "No, Jose," she had replied, embracing the young man who had stood beside her when it mattered most. "You changed everything for yourself. I just helped remove some obstacles." The ripple effects continued to spread across the city and beyond. Sarah Chen's documentary series on workplace discrimination had sparked legislation requiring bias training in the hospitality industry. Marcus had implemented comprehensive sensitivity programs across his restaurant chain, becoming a model for others to follow. Vincent Sterling, meanwhile, had quietly donated a substantial sum to the Dorothy Williams Foundation with a note that simply read, "Professor Williams would be proud. His teachings live on through you." Even Richard Beaumont's story had taken an unexpected turn. After losing several major contracts due to public boycotts, he had been forced to sell his controlling interest in the Beaumont Group. But rather than disappearing into bitter exile, he had surprised everyone by entering therapy and eventually issuing a genuine public apology. "I spent 40 years being angry at a teacher who tried to show me a better way," he had written in a letter published in the local newspaper. "Dr. Keisha Williams forced me to confront the man I had become, and I didn't like what I saw. I'm working to be better, not just for my reputation but for my soul." Keisha had returned to the Sorbonne part-time, teaching via video conference and developing a new curriculum called Ethics in Economic Inequality. Her classes had become the most popular in the philosophy department, drawing students from around the world who wanted to learn from the professor who had stood up to injustice and won. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simplest one. Every evening, Dorothy and Keisha still read together, but now their ritual included reviewing scholarship applications from young people who dared to dream beyond their circumstances. "Your father would be so proud," Dorothy said one evening as they finished reading a particularly moving essay from a teenage girl whose parents cleaned office buildings at night so she could attend school during the day. Keisha touched her father's watch, feeling its steady tick against her chest. "I think he knew this day would come. He always said the truth has a way of demanding to be heard." 6 months after the broadcast, Keisha stood at the podium of the National Civil Rights Conference, looking out at an audience that included waiters and professors, students and CEOs, people of every background united by a shared commitment to justice. "I didn't choose to become a symbol," she began, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the auditorium. "I just chose not to stay silent. The question isn't whether injustice exists. We all know it does. The question is, when it happens in front of you, what will you do?" She paused, thinking of her father's lessons, her mother's strength, and all the young people whose dreams depended on someone having the courage to speak truth to power. Today, somewhere, someone is being told they don't belong. Today, someone is choosing between speaking up or staying silent. Today, someone just like you has the power to change everything. The audience was completely still, hanging on every word. "My father taught me that dignity is not a privilege to be earned. It's a birthright to be honored. Education is not about accumulating degrees. It's about accumulating wisdom. And justice is not a destination. It's a journey we take together." She looked out at the faces before her, seeing in them the same potential her father had recognized in every student who entered his classroom. The sophistication test isn't about knowing which fork to use or how to pronounce French wines. It's about how we treat the person who serves us, the colleague who looks different from us, the student who struggles to belong. Every day we all take this test. Every interaction is an opportunity to pass or fail. As Keisha concluded her speech, the audience rose in thunderous applause. But she was already thinking about tomorrow. There would be more scholarships to award, more young minds to inspire, more injustices to confront with the weapons her father had given her. Knowledge, compassion, and the unshakable belief that every human being deserves dignity. Walking off the stage, She felt the familiar weight of her father's watch and heard his voice echoing across the years. La vérité libère. The truth liberates. And it had. Not just her, but countless others who now knew that their voices mattered, their dreams were valid, and their place in this world was wherever they chose to stand and make it better. The question now, as it had always been, was simple. When your moment comes, will you be ready?